The late Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist and survivor of Hitler's concentration camps you read about in Chapter 5, often helped his patients gain perspective, and when he successfully did this, it changed their lives. For example, Frankl helped an elderly and severely depressed man who came to him for therapy. The man's wife had died, and she had meant more to him than anything in the world. How could Frankl help this man gain some perspective on such a tragic event? What would have happened, Frankl asked the man, if you had died first and your wife would have survived you? The man answered, "Oh, for her this would have been terrible. How she would have suffered." "You see," said Frankl, "such a suffering has been spared her, and it is you who have spared her this suffering, but now you have to pay for it by surviving and mourning her." The man didn't say anything. He shook Dr. Frankl's hand and calmly left. He'd gained an entirely different perspective on his situation in an instant. Frankl wrote, "Suffering ceases to be suffering in some way at the moment it finds a meaning, such as the meaning of a sacrifice." Frankl changed the man's perspective, and it had a profound effect on the man's feelings. When you know how to gain perspective, you know how to change the meaning of a circumstance. Your new perspective changes the meaning of the event, which changes the feelings you have in response, which changes what actions you take, and it all changes in an instant. Subtitle: What would help? Here's how to gain perspective in the simplest and most direct way. When something happens, ask yourself, what perspective would help right now? My wife Classy is on a 12-day trip as I write this. I couldn't go. During the planning stage, I was sad about this. I miss her when she's gone. But I asked myself, what perspective would help right now? I realized I would be alone and entirely uninterrupted by any consideration of another person, and this is, of course, potentially useful for a writer, and I thought I should take full advantage of it. The question shifted my attention into a new direction, changing my feelings about the upcoming event. Ask yourself the question. That's how to gain perspective quickly and easily. Classy has been gone 4 days now, and I've been doing some great writing. I'm able to concentrate more than usual. All this attention to my work has also kept my mind from dwelling on how much I miss her. When you're facing an upcoming event you really don't want to happen, try asking yourself, what perspective would help right now? If no answer comes immediately to mind, that's not the end of it. Ask the question over and over, or sit down and write out a list of 10 answers to the question. The question works for events that will happen, and it also works for events that have already happened. For example, right after I self-published my first book, I called bookstores to ask if I could fax them a blurb on my new book, and about a third of the people I called had a negative reaction. They were probably bombarded by ads, which wasted their fax machine's paper. This was before fax machines could receive a fax without printing it. And besides, I may have interrupted the person with my phone call. For whatever reason, I got some negative reactions, and when I did, it brought me down. When I got several negative reactions in a row, I felt dejected, and I thought negative things like, this is hopeless. But I asked myself, what perspective would help right now? Almost immediately, I thought, the world needs this book. The negativity I heard on the other end of the phone line didn't make these people happy or healthy or more successful. They needed help, and not just them, but lots of people would be helped by my book. I couldn't give up now. With this new perspective, I shifted from dejected to determined and motivated. A nice shift. I went back at it with renewed resolve. The 3 reframe techniques I like the most are comparison reframes, which you read about earlier, visualizing goals, which you will read about shortly, and gratitude. Comparison reframes take advantage of the fact that your mind naturally and automatically compares your situation to something else, usually to something better, so it makes you feel bad. But you can, of course, deliberately compare your situation to something worse and feel better. Having a goal almost automatically reframes many of the setbacks in your life. It casts the setback in a new light. For example, Nelson Mandela had been in prison for much of his life. He was fighting for the end of apartheid in South Africa, and the government had locked him up. He still had his goal, though. One day they moved him to a new area of the prison, away from the people he knew. He was now isolated. He was in a dark, damp cell instead of the sunnier cell he used to have. All of this made him feel bad at first. But then he started thinking this might be a good time to begin negotiations with the government, away from the eyes of his fellow political prisoners, many of whom would have tried to dissuade him from negotiating. Because of his goal, he had a different perspective on his new cell. In a sense, focusing on his goal changed his perspective about his circumstances. Subtitle: Playing with Perspectives. Today I went for a jog. I went along the lake the same way I usually go, and I noticed I was looking at it with this perspective. I've seen this same scenery hundreds of times. But then I thought about the fact that someday this won't be here anymore, or I won't be here anymore. Someday this moment, these times, these days will be gone. And I'll probably look back fondly on these times and wish I could see this scenery again, and be this age again, and be in these times again. But I won't be able to. This time will pass, and I'll never be able to go back, except in my memory. This thought changed my perspective, and it changed the way I felt. I didn't have to go out of my way to do this. I was already running. I was already thinking. I didn't have to stop doing what I was doing. I just changed the way I was thinking a little bit, and it changed the quality of my experience for the better. I've already seen this scenery hundreds of times is one perspective, one of many possible perspectives, and not the most life-giving by any means. Someday I'll look back on this fondly is another perspective, and one with more value. It has more value in the sense that it helps me be here and savor this moment. It makes me feel better. When I thought about looking back on the scenery fondly, I remember doing that before, thinking back to some moment in my childhood or even a few years ago and feeling a longing for being there and experiencing it again. And then I said to myself gently, and someday you'll think of this moment right now in the same way. The end result was somehow I generated a feeling of longing for what I was experiencing at the moment, and it was a beautiful experience. By playing with my perspective, I transformed a routine experience into something memorable and meaningful. Sometimes when Classy and I are taking a walk through our fair city, we imagine we are tourists looking at the city for the first time, and again it changes our perspective. Sometimes we look at each other, pretending we have just met, and this also gives us a different perspective, allowing a greater appreciation for each other. These are all ways to trick the mind into being here and experiencing the world rather than taking things for granted. Subtitle: Gratitude as a Reframe. While a different perspective can often make you feel gratitude, you can use gratitude itself to gain a new perspective, and this simple act can make you measurably happier. In the study where the subject spent only 5 minutes a day writing in a journal, answering the question, "What am I grateful for?" people became happier. Even after they stopped doing it, they were still measurably happier for some time after. Gratitude is itself a reframe, and it can significantly change your state. Back before we had read about the gratitude studies, Classy casually gave me a very simple suggestion that made me happier. She said, "Whenever you feel discouraged, think of something you're grateful for." I've done it hundreds, maybe thousands of times now, and every time it is surprisingly easy to think of something I'm grateful for, and it makes me feel better every time. Does gratitude sound like work? Does it seem like counting your blessings would be a kind of chore? That's the wrong way to think about it. You never need to feel like you should sit down and write in a journal for a specified length of time or try to write down a specified number of things I feel grateful for. That's how they do it in the experiments, but of course that's because it's an experiment. They have to test quantifiable, measurable tasks in an experiment. That doesn't mean you have to. Generating a little gratitude works well on the fly and in your head just as well as it does writing it down in a journal. It's not a chore at all. It's just a simple question to ask yourself. It only takes a few moments, just long enough to think of something. And as soon as you think of something, you feel noticeably better. I found that if the first thing I think of doesn't raise my mood enough, I can easily ask myself what else I'm grateful for. You and I naturally have our attention on our goals and what we'd like to attain in the future, and the mind naturally compares our goals to what we have now. It compares what we have with what we want to have. That's motivating sometimes, but it can also make you feel dissatisfied. It is equally legitimate and ought to get equal billing to think about what you have compared to others or compared to your past, or what you have gained, or what you are just plain glad about. Try it next time you feel discouraged or frustrated. Ask yourself, what one thing am I grateful for? And see what happens. It's a simple, all-purpose mood raiser you can keep in your back pocket and use a lot. When you do, you'll be happier. Use comparison reframes, gratitude, and your own goals to gain a new perspective on an upcoming event, on the past, or on a situation you're dealing with right in the present. Or you can simply ask, what perspective would help right now? And start coming up with answers. A mastery of perspective can reliably, authentically, and measurably change your life. The end. This has been an excerpt from the book, How to Change the Way You Think About Things in Plain English. This is Adam Lee Kahn on The Atom Bomb. This Atom Bomb podcast episode is sponsored by Anchor, a podcast platform, the one I'm using to make this podcast. It's super easy to use and allows you to easily create your own podcast. You can record and edit your audio right onto the app. In fact, you can do everything on your phone. Anchor also makes it easy to monetize your podcast and get wide distribution. Anchor automatically makes your podcast available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and more. You can download the Anchor app for free or go to anchor.fm to get started.